Hi, my name is Ben, and this is a Pebble for Your Shoe. So, this video is really geared more towards a question that my Bible study, Tuesday night Bible study group with my friend Alex and some of his relatives, his brothers and friends are part of. And also, the same question was brought up by some of my other friends at my home church, Remnant. Some other friends were asking a very similar question. And so I kind of answered it briefly, but I'm going to go a little bit more in depth so that you guys can get a full illustration of what it was I was talking about. So we're talking about Exodus and the Mount Sinai experience and regarding the the rock of Oreb, and it was after the the Israelites had left Egypt, right? And they go 3 days, and then what happens in the desert if you go 3 days without water? You could die, right? So they get to the point where they're at this pool called Mara, and they throw this stick in the water, and the stick turns the water from bitter to sweet, and they're able to drink from it. And they go 3 more days, and they have another crisis on their hands where they don't have water. They're still in the desert, and so they need a drink to survive. And this time, God does something different. He tells Moses that go take your staff and strike the rock. And it's like, which rock is it? And it'll be the rock that I'm standing on, Moses. And so Moses goes and he strikes the rock, and water comes out, right? And so that's 6 days in the desert. Now we know that it's not just a few days that they're in the desert. They spend an entire 40 years in the desert. And so these are the only two stories until we get to the third story in the book of Numbers, where there's another incident where Moses strikes a rock. And so you have to ask the question, what happened the rest of the every 3 days for the 40 years? Where do they get their water from? And what some of the rabbis and the sages argue with each other, because it's not in the text, but it is in the oral tradition, which is the Tanakh, and they teach it in the Midrash that the rock of Oreb that the Lord stood upon, that Moses struck, they say that using logic, if they go every 3 days, the rock must have followed them through the desert, through the wilderness. Now, this isn't in the divinely inspired text of Moses's 5 books, but it is, something that they say is in the Tanakh, because that's the written version of the oral tradition, and that's the tradition that Moses taught to Joshua. Joshua passed that on to the judges passed that on to the judges passed it on to the prophets to the rabbis, and the rabbis eventually, Akiva wrote down the oral tradition into the Tanakh, right? And so that's how it came about, the understanding that the rabbis argue that the rock of Oreb followed them for the 40 years. Every 3 days, Moses would strike the rock, and water would flow. And so I say all that just to kind of recap what we discussed in our study. And so, what kind of cues can we get? What kind of messages was nature giving through this story of striking a rock? And like for 40 years, what kind of illustration is the children of Israel seeing through this? You have to think about it. These guys in Israel, they're newly set free slaves, right? They're just learning this relationship with God, and it's going from being a slave into this constant. Every 3 days, this miraculous thing would happen, right? It's different than what we live in, which is very non-miraculous stuff, right? We live in a scientific world. So if you can put that aside for now, change that lens and look at through the lens of Israel, who was going from slavery, and their whole worldview has to change, and they're seeing this whole paradigm shift of meeting God, and all these miracles are happening, right? They leave Egypt, all these miraculous plagues, the Red Sea parts, that's miraculous. The water is turned from bitter to sweet, that's miraculous. They're seeing manna from heaven. They're seeing the quail from heaven. They're seeing serpents and scorpions, all these things that should be attacking them in the desert. They're not. They're being held back. So they're seeing miracle after miracle after miracle, and like every 3 days, they're getting water from a rock, which would be really weird. Um, so what is being illustrated here in nature? Um, it's like God is breaking the back of nature, breaking the back of science. Laws of physics and chemistry and biology that we understand, its back is being broken when God intervenes into our world. Nature bends its knee. Nature's back is literally broken because if you think about it, what is a rock? God created a rock to do what? God created rocks to do absolutely nothing but just be a rock and lay flat. And that's their version of worship, right? If you create a creation, God creates you to do this, and you're doing it, then you're doing everything God told you to do, right? What is it that the Bible describes um, Noah as? They've described Noah as a Zoddik, right? A righteous man. Now, why is he righteous? In Hebrew, Zadok means there's this idea of charity attached to it. That Melchizedek, right? Melchizedek, the king of righteousness. Why was he righteous? Because he gave charitably to Abraham. He gave a tenth of everything he had to Abraham. And so his name is literally Melchizedek. Melchizedek, as a lot of Westerners will say. But it's really not his name. It's really more of a title. He's the king of righteousness. Why is he righteous? Because he's charitable. So who's the other person in all of the 5 books of Moses that's called a Zoddik? There's only one other person who's called a Zoddik, and that's Noah. Why is Noah a Zoddik? Because he did everything God asked him to do, right? And so there's the idea is that similar to Melchizedek, he was asked to give to Abraham, and he did. So he's called a Zoddik. He did what God asked him to do. He gave him a tenth. Noah in the same way. He did everything God instructed him to do to build the ark, get the animals in there, and save the world. And so he's called a Zoddik for it. He did everything God asked him. So the idea here is that when rocks do what rocks are created to do, it's almost in a way righteousness. When the plants do what God asked them to do, create fruit, to bear seeds, to make oxygen, they're in a way worshiping God. They're doing what they're asked to do, what they were created to do. And so why do I even bring this up? It's because when a rock is struck and water comes from a rock, that's not normal. God has to break its back. It's doing what it's asked to do, right? Rocks aren't made to give water. They struggle to give water. So, you know, tarantulas, snakes, scorpions, they're made to sting and bite, but yet they didn't sting and bite. They did what they yielded. They bent their knee, so to say. They don't have knees, but you know what I'm saying. That they did what they were instructed to do, which is to not attack Israel while they were in the desert for 40 years. When nature encounters God and God asks it to do something apart from what it was originally created to do, and it does it, that's God breaking its back, bending its knee, and it's worshiping God in that way. So that I say all that to paint this illustration that I got, and that is that if a rock, which is created to do nothing but sit around and to endure the elements and to survive in a desert, is willing to get its back broken and bring forth water, how much more are we that are not rocks, that God asks us to do something? How much more are we to bend our knee or have our backs broken to worship Him? When the idea is that Moses struck the rock, but when you get to Numbers, God says, "I'm going to do something different. Moses, I want you to speak to the rock. I don't want to have to break your back. I don't want to break the rock's back anymore. I don't want to have to make his knee bend. I want this rock to be spoken to and to just worship me and do what I ask him to do without having to break its back. I'm changing the pattern here, Moses. But unfortunately, due to like 40 years of habitually just taking a rod up and striking a rock, and that's what Moses did as kind of muscle memory. Um, and so there was a valuable lesson that was kind of missed, but the lesson is still going out today because his word is eternal, right? It's the same yesterday, today, and forever, just like God is. That's the truth, right? So, yeah. If it was true for Moses back then and for Israel, it's still true today. God doesn't want to have to break nature's back. He doesn't want to have to break our backs. He wants us to just listen when He speaks, and for us to pour out water like the rock of Oreb. And and that's pretty much all I've got for you for this one. But hopefully, this answers the question that you guys were asking me. Um, that it's about obedience, disobedience versus obedience, and what is it that we learn from Saul, King Saul, right? It's like obedience is better than sacrifice. And that's what I think it was Samuel who said that to him when he rebuked him when he remember Saul went out and had a battle with a city. He was instructed to destroy everything and leave it as a burnt offering to God. The animals, the sheep, the oxen, all the people, they were supposed to burn it all down. But yet Samuel heard bleating of the sheep and the oxen, and Saul said, I was going to make this as a sacrifice, as an offering to the Lord. And Samuel says it's better to obey than to sacrifice. And then he hacked up that king with his sword. But the lesson to learn here is that, when God, if a rock can listen to God and not have to be broken and pour out water, doing something it's not created to do, how much more should we be held accountable when God wants to speak to us and ask us to do stuff? That's what real worship is. Just being obedient. That's what it means to be exotic. So, yeah, that's kind of the illustration I was trying to explain, but we just didn't have the time to go over it at Remnant or at Alex Bible Study. So, hope this helps. Bye.